is Taino, which were the first people that met Columbus. Is that right? Yeah. And he's also the president of the Florida, or of the American Indian movement here in Florida. So it's we have been in contact with Robert different times. I'd like to ask him to share some greetings from indigenous people from the country or from Florida, wherever. So, Robert, what do you have to say?
Taiwai Titiono, Gena Tationo. I said good greetings to all my brothers and sisters. It is known that we are all brothers and sisters. We're all natural beings, and we're all here not to extract resources, but to live in harmony, because even the grass, even our trees, everything is in sync with us. And when we move out of sync, it causes much evil and it causes much distress. So what I do want to say is, Tarinkin Buyate. And what that means is, I see you. And when I tell somebody I see you, I see more than the facial appearance. I see your heart. I see your struggles. I see you. I see you as a good person and also as one with nature. So when somebody says that from my people, that means we see you and we know your heart and we love you for that. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. And also have your wife here today. No. Oh, look. Okay.
He's my mentor. I'm part of
Oh, you're a mentor. Okay. And your name?
City.
Glad to have you here with us.
Means sharp in our language.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Well, as I said, I'm Reverend David Houseel. I'm a retired UCC minister and a member here at Windermere Union Church. I would like to introduce those from Windsong's presentation team today. And they are here doing their best to do the narration and to take care of you as you go on the blankets. Our narrators are Debbie Heisinger and Carl Keeper. Our blanket attendants are Mary Ellen and Ralph, and Roseanne and Shrock. And assisting them are Shay and Addison Rankin. We invite you to participate in what could be a very powerful experience for you. Although you might be hesitant, we believe that if you trust the process, you will have some profound and deeply spiritual moments. You see in front of you several pieces of cloth. We call them blankets. It is our understanding that the blanket exercise began in Canada as a result of First Nation people talking to Mennonite farmers about the land they had lost. They used blankets on the ground to simulate the various tribes impacted by the arrival of the Europeans. Our purpose today is similar, but with us focusing on 17 principal tribes here in Florida that have comparable experiences with the newcomers from Europe. In a few moments, we'll ask you to step onto the blankets. Initially, when you come on the blankets, we ask all of you to come out because we like to take a picture of everybody on the blankets or a still picture or whatever, and face the altar if you would. So I'll call you up when that happens, or someone will. Choose when you do come, then, and choose to be on the blankets. Choose where you will stand, but be assured you can move, and in fact, you will need to do so as the blankets are reduced in size as the tribes experience land loss. You may return to your seats whenever you choose. The attendants are there to reduce the tribal areas, but also to help you as the story unfolds. When you do move, please be careful. We do not want anyone to trip and fall. You might notice that there are tribal names on the blankets. So when you step on the blankets, please notice the tribal name that's there where you're standing. Consider the blanket your home. Imagine the experiences of families enjoying their land. Think about them hunting and fishing. What about the homes they are building and how hard they work? We cannot forget the marriages they enjoyed, the birth of children. Imagine the many deaths they faced, the burial of elders. Imagine the many what they endured, what were their sacred memories. And how did they relate to the Great Spirit? Can you sense the pride they felt in this sense of harmony? Then, as things begin to change, you will begin to experience land loss. As blankets are gathered and made smaller, it will represent engagements between you, a native person, and the unfamiliar and threatening Europeans. You will realize that you must move. So gather closer together until your land is lost. Eventually, almost all of it will be gone. And when it is gone, that will indicate the loss of your homes, your sacred shrines, and your familiar territory and way of life. What your culture has known and accomplished for centuries is fading and will soon disappear. At that moment, the reality is that your way of life is dying. You have been forced to move, or you have had to flee wherever you can, so you and your loved ones are hopefully able to survive. So, now let us begin our story.
Imagine with me Jesus and his followers several weeks after Easter. They are gathered that morning on a hilltop as he talks to them about going throughout the world, preaching and baptizing. He promises to be with them and then disappears. We call it the Ascension. His words were the Great Commission. Our purpose today is to reflect on these final words, review some of our history, and hopefully change our future. It's painful to admit how frequently those words have been used to hurt people and destroy their culture. Within a few short centuries, the followers of the way, as we call early Christians, became part of an empire. Our focus will be on our history in the Americas, and especially here in the state of Florida. Firmly planted in Europe, the Christian movement became a powerful force, even before Christopher Columbus set foot on the sands of this continent. A foundation had been laid. In 1455, 37 years before Columbus discovered America, Pope Nicholas V issued an edict declaring permission to conquer non-Christian nations. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI created what has become known as the Doctrine of Discovery, called the Christian Law of Nations. It asserted that European powers had the divine right to claim absolute title to and authority over indigenous people and their lands. Here's some of the harsh words of this doctrine. You, who are concerned about the integrity and spread of the faith, we grant you full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate these unbelievers and enemies of Christ, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. In 1823, this doctrine of discovery was quietly adopted into U.S. law by the United States Supreme Court. In essence, its decision gave Native Americans only the right of occupancy, which could be taken away at any time. Shortly thereafter, in 1510, the requerimento was issued by the Council of Castile to be read in conquered lands, like the Americas. It was often read without interpreters or just deposited on the shore. These nearly 1,000 words define how to obey the Spanish and the consequences of failing to do so. It clearly defined the Pope as head of the whole world and superior of the universe. Again, here's some of these words. If you obey, you shall receive all love and charity. But if you do not, we shall powerfully enter your country, make war against you in all ways, shall take you and your wives and your children and make slaves, take away all your goods, and do all mischief and damage that we can. And the death and losses will be your fault. Then in 1845, the phrase manifest destiny served to strengthen these messages. We now invite you to come onto the blankets. Take your time and walk carefully. We will take whatever time necessary for you to walk onto these blankets to claim your tribal land, and for these moments, hold it sacred. Be my guest.
No, I'm not going to do that. Go ahead.
Plenty of room up here in the front. I know it's church, but our story today will describe the near total land loss for the indigenous people in Florida. There have been many European attempts to find slaves near the end of the 1400s, but the acknowledged discovery is 1513. It was March 4, 1513, when Ponce de Leon set sail from Puerto Rico with his 3 ships and 200 men. They sailed for several days, sighting land on Easter Sunday, March 27th, and finally landed on April 2nd. We're not sure exactly where they first set foot. Some say St. Augustine, probably farther south. This was the land of the Timucua, the largest indigenous tribe of perhaps 200,000, consisting of 35 chiefdoms, several sub-tribes, and several languages. Their land covered 19,000 square miles. Their largest village was near today's Jacksonville. Their men were about 4 inches taller than the Europeans. They wore tattoos, had 2 types of ball games, were experts with blowguns, spears, bow and arrows. Ponce de Leon and his party sailed farther south into the area of today's Jupiter. It is believed that he engaged with the Ace tribe and the Yanga tribes, located along the eastern shore. The Ace lived around Cape Canaveral and the Indian River, had numerous villages and a population of about 20,000. They were a unique people, wore their hair long, painted themselves, and were expert fishermen. They could dive very deep because of an unusual ear formation. They were also seen riding whales bareback. The Ross Hammock site, south of New Smyrna Beach, is one of their principal burial mounds. The Yanga were related to the Ace through marriage and lived south of them along the coast. Their homes were wigwam style. They were experts in carving canoes from cypress trees and frequently salvaged precious metals from shipwrecks. It is reported that Ponce de Leon remained with them about a week. We hope some of the explorers tried to show respect to the native people. In those early days, there seems to have been no principal attempt to confiscate. It was as if the Spanish invaders were simply passing by and observing the residents. For the inhabitants of this rich land, the newcomers seemed strange, but not clearly a threat. There were no tensions, no wars. The Spanish just moved around, exploring and probably thinking about eventually settling there. As Ponce de Leon moved around to the southern point of the peninsula, they entered the territory of the Calusa. On May 23rd, they were driven off by the Calusa, perhaps near today's Port Charlotte. This seems to be the first actual skirmish. The Calusa covered the southwestern coast of Florida and may have been as many as 50,000. Their name means fierce people, but they are often called shell people because of their extensive use of shells. Their homes were communal in 2 stories. They had established extensive estuaries. They believed that within each person the soul consisted of 3 aspects, similar to our psychological belief that each person has a subconscious, a conscious, and a superconscious. At this point, there had been no actual land loss by any of the tribes engaged with by the Spanish. By 1528, the Narvaez expedition moved into the territory of the Appalachian and the Potano tribes, who lived in the Panhandle in north-central Florida. The Appalachian were a large tribe, estimating 50,000 to 60,000, with their largest village site, the Veldon Mound, north of Tallahassee. They were excellent farmers, hunters, fishermen, and became part of the vast trade network that reached all the way to the Great Lakes. The Potano lived close to what we call Gainesville. They are one of the most powerful of the Tumaco tribes. Evidence of their culture is found at the Potano Paddling Trail, with the largest discovery of 138 native canoes. It was the Narvaez expedition that introduced European diseases. This begins the loss of people, but not land. In 1539, the actual conquest of native lands begins with Hernando de Soto coming with 700 soldiers who attacked the Potano and the Timucua villages, stealing their possessions and making many of them slaves. By 1584 and 1565, Pedro de Mendez de Aviles arrived at Biscayne Bay. Seteria were one of the larger subgroups of the Tamaqua and lived among the St. Johns River. They played a major role in the establishment of European settlements, working with the French Huguenots and later with the Spanish, helping to build Fort Carolina. Smallpox impacted them heavily, and they quickly began to experience the loss of life and confiscation of land. Then, in 1565, Pedro Mendez de Villas arrived in Biscayne Bay to contest the territory. This tribe was quite large, perhaps 10,000, and lived in what we now know as the Miami area, Broward County, and all the way down to the Florida Keys. Their homes were sometimes 5 stories high. Evidence of their culture in the prominent Miami Circle Village, which is one of the oldest prehistoric sites in the United States. Accompanying such invasions, there has always been land loss. By 1584, war had begun between the Spanish and various native tribes. By the end of the 16th century, the Tamaqua, once over 200,000, was reduced to about 1,000. By the end of the 19th century, the Tamaqua were extinct. More frequent and intense conflict began, not only between the Spanish and the natives, but also between the tribes. The Sarawak of Brevard and Volusia counties, who had cooperated with the Spanish mission, were then attacked by the Spanish and the Tamaqua.
So far, we have introduced 9 native tribes, and before we leave the 16th century, we would like to introduce 8 other tribes. The Chateau lived in Upper Apalachicola and the Chipola River areas. We don't know a lot about them, but we do know they were mound builders. Their population was about 1,000 to 1,500 at the time the Europeans came. Following the building of a mission, many became Roman Catholics. The Choctaw were among the first code talkers during World War I. Those in Florida were known as the Eastern Choctaw and lived in the Panhandle. They honored the sun, believed in good and evil spirits, and had clear gender roles, yet practiced equality between men and women. George Washington considered them one of the 5 civilized tribes. The Creek, also one of the civilized tribes, had a population in Florida of about 20,000. Those in Florida were known as the Eastern Creek or the Muskogee. Their towns were in Walton County and were identified by peace and war. Each clan was known by the name of a different animal. The Miami, meaning big water, lived around Lake Okeechobee. They lived in small hamlets of 30 to 40 people and had their own unique dugout canoes. Some believe they originally came from the Yucatan Peninsula. The Miccosukee are one of the federally recognized tribes in Florida today. They originally came south from Georgia, pushed here by Europeans who had invaded their territory. Today there are about 600 Miccosukee along the Tamiami Trail and in the Everglades. They have their own gaming casino in Dade County. The Mocama were known as people of water. They were a sub-tribe of the Tamaqua and had come south from Georgia, settling near Jacksonville and the nearby islands. Their civilization goes back to 2500 BCE, and they created some of the oldest pottery discovered in America. The Seminole, undoubtedly the most familiar to us, were the only tribe to have ever defeated U.S. forces. They call themselves the unconquered people. They originally came from Georgia, settled initially in the Panhandle before relocating to the Everglades. They had open-air, thatched roof homes called chickees. They once had the largest cattle operation in Florida. The Seminole were one of the civilized tribes to again use their label originated by George Washington. The Tocobaga lived along the shores of Tampa Bay, principally at Safety Harbor. They were great hunters and fishermen, ate manatee, and were expert potters, and were considered some of the original source of the story of Pocahontas. This concludes our list of 17 principal tribes, but there were many lesser tribes or groupings. We have been able to identify 30 more. The 17th century saw both efforts to work together and growing conflict. Our narrative will only touch on a few of these. Undoubtedly, people, both indigenous and Europeans, were making decisions every day that either united them or would lead to more conflict. The newcomers believed they were doing the right and moral thing. Yet, as they baptized indigenous people, they disregarded their traditions and desecrated their sacred spaces. The newcomers were constructing European-style missions, a change the newcomers generally considered an acceptable form of land loss. We must note some potential peaceful developments that could have reduced the tensions, but still had intrusive impacts. As we list several of these, you will note the increasing shrinking of land. The Suruke, when another explorer moved in, the Patano, due to the building of the mission at San Francisco, the Appalachee, following the building of the San Luis de Tamilia mission, the chateau, after another mission is built, in 1695, a group of Yaga walked 200 miles to St. Augustine to meet with John Dickerson to work out a treaty, a genuine effort to make peace. We must also identify some of the growing tensions and attacks that were occurring. There are many but we will list a few. In 1614, another battle with the Calusa. In 1647, the Appalachian rebelled against the Spanish. In 1656, the Patano rebelled and their population soon dropped from 3,000 to 160. In 1685, the Spanish brought their own cattle ranchers who spread out over Florida. By 1695, battles were becoming more frequent between the tribes. One such attack was by the Lower Creek against the Chateau. The chateaux were captured while others fled to Alabama. At 4 years later, the remaining chateau joined the Spanish in attacking the Timucua. It's fine, it's not removed yet. It should be noted that although the principal occupier during these years was the Spanish, the French and English were also emerging as either an ally or another European invader. The 18th century witnessed the birth of the new nation, accompanied by major land loss. Although much of Queen Anne's War in 1702 was further north, it affected the tribes in the Panhandle. The Appalachee witnessed many fleeing to Louisiana. In 1704, this marked the death of the Patano and Tocobaga tribes. Sometime in the early 1700s, settlers from the province of Carolina, with their Native American allies, began raiding the A's, who began to lose homes and their way of life. In 1710, 280 Miamis were captured and sent to Cuba. During 1711, a large group of Calusa were captured and sent to Cuba. By 1760, the A's tribe, one of the first tribes to experience the Europeans, are extinct. In 1763, the Spanish evacuated the remaining 89 Mocama, the Indian missions. During 1711, a large group of Calusa were captured and sent to Cuba. By 1760, the A's tribe, one of the first tribes, I went back and repeated. 1763, the Spanish evacuated, and they got that one. Sometime in 1770, the Spanish invaders sent a letter to the Vatican asking if killing Indians was a sin, with no designation if they were friendly or not, or even if there was any conflict. By this time, all Tequesta villages were deserted. And yet, between 1790 and 1833, the Creeks signed 11 treaties with the new U.S. government. Just like other tribes, they were attempting to make concessions and form agreements with these people who seemed intent on taking their land. With the birth of the new nation, we would hope the church would play more beneficial role. Yet it was part of the growing empire. It would become complicit in its colonization. It was not only engaged, it often directed the process and benefited from the displacement and forcible relocation of indigenous people. Some faithful people may have tried to find alternative paths, but the confiscation of land and near total elimination of all cultural and sacred paths of indigenous people was the pattern. When we looked at the U.S., our report is a small reflection of a much larger reality. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson invaded Florida with his forces and had them burn over 300 Miccosukee homes. The same year, Jackson led U.S. troops against the remaining indigenous people in Florida, beginning the 3 Seminole Wars. These were wars that cost over $20 million in U.S. dollars, which today is equivalent to $1.2 billion. This caused non-Seminole natives to join with the Seminoles, ultimately resulting in the loss of their land. In the same year, in 1823, the Moultrie Creek Treaty was signed, which set aside to Native American tribes the central part of Florida from Jacksonville to Tampa, approximately 4 million acres. About 400 indigenous leaders participated, representing many tribes. All what we know as of Central Florida was included, except for 15 miles to the Gulf of Mexico and 20 miles to the Atlantic, which was reserved for settlers. This could have been an extremely huge protection of the land of the indigenous people, but it only lasted 9 years. When Andrew Jackson became president, he changed the government's response to what he called the Indian problem. For President Washington was to civilize them. For Jackson, it was to remove them, which meant to kill them. Despite resistance from Congress and a decision by the Supreme Court rendering indigenous people as sovereign nations, the Indian Removal Act became law in 1830. The Choctaw in Florida became one of the first tribes forced upon the Trail of Tears, and their land was lost. In 1832, the Payne's Landing Treaty eliminated the Moultrie Treaty and brought in forced removal across the state. The Creek people escaped the trail by fleeing south to join with the Seminole. The Florida legislature even passed a law forbidding Indian as a legal identity. As a result of governmental pressure, indigenous leaders like Chief Billy Bowlegs convinced large groups of indigenous people to move to Oklahoma. Undoubtedly, one of the most extensive assaults on Native life was establishing the Indian boarding schools. Though they emerged after 1879 from the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Indian boarding school and spread across 29 states with 408 similar schools, they grew out of an experiment in Florida. In 1874, Captain Richard Pratt, after fighting Native Americans in the West, came to the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine. There, with his native prisoners, he set out to kill the Indian but save the man. By using Christian teachings, forcing them to wear uniforms and cutting their hair, he to eradicate their culture. After his 5-year experiment, he moved to Carlisle, and the boarding school was born. And finally, the Dawes Allotment Act and Curtis Act of the late 1800s attempted both to break up tribes and confiscate land. With the new century, the only remaining indigenous people were those in the Everglades. With the 20th century, attempts were made to turn the tide and protect indigenous peoples' land. Yet in 1953, the U.S. government tried to terminate any recognition of the Miccosukee people. So in 1959, a group of Miccosukee members went to Cuba and were recognized by Fidel Castro as a sovereign nation. 3 years later, the U.S.